Hey, what's up? You back at my channel. I'm Pat. We're listening to Altar, Youth Against Christ. Funny-ass song title. You're at Ground Zero Salem, and I have a huge stack of death metal CDs to talk about. If you sense maybe there's been a theme lately, I've been listening to and buying up lots and lots of death metal. Kind of come back from my little hardcore binge that I was on earlier this year and last year. Just going nuts, trying to track down old death metal CDs, bands that I'm only, peripherally familiar with or have never heard, want to get into. This is the Other Altar. This is a band from, I think they're from the Netherlands, I believe they're Dutch. There's an Altar from Sweden who are also very good. This is deicide worshipping Euro stuff. Not too much heavily in the way of the dual track vocals, but definitely like rhythmically, the shotgun blast beats on this. Very good. I mean, it was cheap. A friend of mine, Andrew, runs a Facebook page for cheap CD deals, mostly on eBay, and I saw this and snagged it. I'd listened to it in the past, and it's just solid, infernal, blasphemous 90s death metal. Divorced from God. It's pretty on the nose, like kind of deicide sort of song title on this. Cauterize the Church Council. Yeah, awesome. Love it. Alright, so whole big old stack of stuff here. I'll try to get through it in a reasonable amount of time, as my time is limited and precious and important as always. First up, I got this Benediction collection on CD. I had the first two. I have a picture disc of Sarcastic Terror, and I have Grand Leveler on tape. Benediction was a band that, I saw a few blogs and a few reviews and a few retrospective things past few years that, was like, oh yeah, they're real mediocre and middle of the line, and I just kind of, accepted that as truth. Actually, it's more than that. It was, 10 years ago when I started reading that. And then I was just like, fuck it, and bought a few things cheap. They were cheap at the time. I think that picture disc was, $15 or something. Tape was cheap. I was like, no, this band's solid as hell, I don't think I quite like them as much as I like Bolt Thrower, but it's very much sort of in that wheelhouse of mid-pace to fast, catchy death metal. I feel like they have a little bit more interesting twists and turns than the aforementioned. They're from Birmingham, and if you didn't know, they featured Barney Greenway as their original vocalist, who was replaced by Dave Ingram by their second record, who had a very similar vocal style, the sort of, enunciated, projected, the guy sounds like he has his own echo on his own voice kind of thing. Fucking great band. I really love Transcend the Rubicon. It's probably their best one. I remember when it came out and a friend of mine bought it. Great Accused cover on it, Wrong Side of the Grave. What's interesting is this is their first 6 albums, omitting their 4th album. So it's albums 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7. Number 4 was called The Dreams You Dread. I was wondering why they cut it out, if it was an executive decision by the band or what have you. I listened to it on YouTube. It's very, mid-paced, kind of groovy kind of stuff that was an infection that was plaguing a lot of death metal bands at the time, I feel like. That had Dave Ingram. He sticks around till Grind Bastard, the next record, which is featured on here, which goes off in a totally different direction. That's almost like a faster crust punk kind of thing with a few death metal leanings. It's got, I feel like, a lot of Extreme Noise Terror / Doom, the band Doom, kind of riffing on it. And then they just kind of take that and do it better and better with each subsequent release until you get to Killing Music. By then, they've replaced their vocalist, Dave, with another Dave, the guy from Anal Nakroth, who I'm not familiar with, but he's a great vocalist, doing that great Benediction style, with those, shouted, growled kind of vocals. And all the songs are short to the point. It's got a strong discharge meets death metal kind of thing. I'm not expecting much by these later albums by these well-known bands that I've never heard, but I'd say this is a very, very solid discography all the way through. These booklets, it's this label Pegasus that does all these. There's a Candlemass one with all the stuff from the 2000s with all King of the Grey Islands and all that. There's Metal Mind Years 1 for Behemoth, which I have. They did an Anti-Cymax one. I'm about to talk about the Sinister one in a minute, which didn't fare as well, in my opinion. But you got all the album art, you got all the lyrics. I think there's a thanks list, but don't expect any kind of like retrospective liner notes by the band or anything like that. But all in all, for under $25, you can't go wrong with these if you're interested in getting a whole bunch of material by one band. So yeah, I got the Sinister one. Diabolical Summoning and Cross the Sticks are two European death metal classics, monoliths of death metal. And I always kind of wondered what they have a gazillion records afterwards. This captures some of them. What are they like? Well, Hate, the record, I think it's the last one with their early lineup that are on those first two, or at least most of it. Last one with their singer Mike. Hate is great. It's got great cover art. Love that demon. Slowing things down a little bit from Diabolical Summoning. It's still great. Very like American tinged death metal. It's got some kind of Cannibal Corpse influences and stuff like that, with kind of moshy kind of breakdowns. But for the most part, it's not much filler there, and it's really great. And then they do go through all these other records: Aggressive Measures, Savage or Grace, Afterburner, which are kind of a mixed bag. There's some good songs. I don't feel like any of those records are really strong all the way through. I did sit down and listen to all of them all the way through a couple of times, and it was, I can't lie, a little bit of a chore. It seems like Afterburner is the fan favorite for as far as all these post-Hate records, and it's good, but it's got a few songs that are like 7 minutes long, and if you're going to do a 7-minute long song, you got to create a vibe, create atmosphere. Obviously, that's working for some of the newer bands like Blood Incantation, Spectral Voice, and all that. Works for Death Doom stuff. This was just like kind of riff after riff after riff, when they could have been maybe divvied up into other songs, if you know what I mean. The riffs are fine, they're good, most of them are pretty heavy and whatnot, but a lot of it was just kind of a riff salad that got fucking boring after a while. A lot of the production's kind of weird too, weirdly thin or kind of lacking bass or separation in the instruments. So Hate is awesome. There's some tracks otherwise, I'm not upset about dropping $20 on this. But yeah, I mean, if you want to check out some Sinister stuff, definitely start with their first three, and then if you're really, really nuts about it, go forward. And if you want, buy the box set. It's cheap enough. So, got a bunch of Swedish stuff now. We're going to go back to Sweden yet again. Most of these are on the Crypt. Dark Descent had a sale, as they are wont to do, and I capitalized. They capitalized off of me, rather. But I got a bunch of Crypt stuff, which is always what I do when they have a sale. If you know anything about my channel, I'm a big fan of reissues on this label. Local label. A guy up the street, Bill Rickham, Mass. So my camera freezes sometimes. And I'm not entirely sure if the tape is still rolling properly, or I'm going to have some weird sync problem with the audio and the video. So I'm just editing this in. Sorry for the herky-jerkiness, but this is not a professional channel. What I bought from the Crypt was the Excruciate Epitaph split, the Epitaph full length, Seeming Salvation, and Passage of Existence by Excruciate. I also have some non-Swedish stuff I'll get into in a minute. In addition to that, I got the Sorcery full length that just got re-released on a different label than the Crypt. Blood Chilling Tales on Thrashing Fist Productions. It's a good label name. And except for one thing here, all this was produced at Sunlight Studios. I think it's the Excruciate side of the split, if I'm not mistaken. All this was produced by Skogsberg at Sunlight Studios. And you can tell. What's interesting is, you have this codified kind of sound. The guy's going for a thing. Obviously, you have that guitar tone, a certain way the production sounds, and what's interesting is kind of hearing what the bands are doing within those parameters, those limits. The Excruciate stuff on this is not produced by him, if I remember right, and you can tell it's a lot heavier, it's a lot kind of darker, it's less dry, there's a little bit more depth to the guitars, and aside from guitar tone and vocal approach, like, the song structures are not your typical kind of, D-beat sort of horror sample kind of deal that like a lot of Swedish bands have. That's sort of like lifted from phantasm thing that Entomb does. There's always the spooky guy talking thing that happens in a lot of Swedish death metal. They're definitely straying away from that. Almost feels like an American style death metal band pushed through a Swedish filter. That's certainly even more so on this one, Passage of Life. There's a lot more going on. There's some really serious blast beats on this and some very slow, crawling, kind of doomy passages. You know, I wouldn't really compare it to Incantation, but I feel like that kind of disparity between tempos is more along the lines of something from across the ocean. This is a great fucking record. Epitaph, I feel like overall on the split and the full length is a little bit more typically Swedish sounding. You know, I do get a lot of Left Hand Path, you know, Ever-Flowing Stream kind of vibes from it, but also they get a little bit more melodic and a little bit more heavy metal leaning, even more so than those records I just mentioned. There's absolutely no keyboards on it, and I feel like most of these types of bands would add a little bit in for flourishes here and there. Nothing like a Nocturnus level kind of deal. And they also blast, but their blasts are a little lighter, you know. The Excruciate blasts are almost like an American style, real heavy hitting kind of blast, but this is a great record as well. There's a little bit more rock, you know, a little bit more heavy metal, but just a tinge, you know. Don't expect like Wolverine Blues or something like that. Great lead work. The production on it, I feel like, is a little thin, but that's a small complaint. Not enough like bass in the mix for me. Lately, lack of being able to hear bass has really been bugging me with a lot of death metal stuff, old and new. And then we have Sorcery, Blood Chilling Tales. So I just got this band 7-inch, paid a healthy amount for it, just because I love old death metal 7 inches. I had a little extra cash, and I remember saying that the 7-inch doesn't really sound like typical Swedish death metal at all. It was way more kind of satanic and loose and kind of 80s style, and I don't know if I said it at the time, but you know, it's almost comparable to like maybe a South American kind of death thrash sort of thing. And that's true, it is, and I feel like one of the demos on here is in that style too. This band had been around since 86, so they weren't some young kids just looking to hop onto the Entombed trend. They, appropriately enough, kind of adjusted some of their sound, or maybe it was Skogsberg's work that gave them that kind of tone for the full length. It definitely sounds like Swedish death metal by the time they arrive at the full length, but they're doing some really interesting shit. They almost kind of lyrically remind me of like a Deceased or something, where all the songs are little miniature stories about horror-related stuff. They're not just vaguely, you know, talking about evil horror stuff. There's something very like definitely like this song's about this. It's a King Diamond Deceased kind of approach, you know what I mean? There's a little bit more in the way of keyboards on this, like creating all kinds of weird atmospheres and stuff. Playing's a little bit looser, you know, intentionally or not, you know, gives it a little bit more of a like old school like thrash or punk kind of vibe to it. So, I mean, the band had been around since 86. I'm sure their sound changed quite a bit between then and when this was released, which was 91. But this is a banger. Good to hear that this had just come out. I think Guttural Monk mentioned it on Instagram. Love for that dude to make a new video, but I know he's a busy guy. So thanks to him for bringing that to my attention. Like I said, I just discovered this band by buying their 7-inch a couple of months ago. Back to the Crypt stuff. This is Death Squad, Into the Crypt, appropriately enough. This is great 89 era style death metal, still 1 foot in thrash, as I like to say. They were also from Holland, I believe. Definitely up your alley if you're into Consuming Impulse by Pestilence. Not just saying that because they're from the same country, but it has that very sharp kind of thrashy riffing, kind of brutal vocals, but still understandable, that sort of thing. Great guitar tone. Guitar tone on the full length, and especially on the demo, tacked on the end here, kind of reminds me of Deteriorate Rotting in Hell. It's that weird, I don't know, that's a tough guitar tone to replicate. I don't think they were doing that on purpose, of course, but especially because this might have come out beforehand. But anyway, this is fucking great. You know, FFO, Scream Bloody Gore, Consuming Impulse, that sort of stuff. Sadist maybe, you know, just towing the line over into death metal from thrash. Sort of in a similar vein, we have Sacrificial here from Denmark. And this sounds a lot like Exhorder to me. Especially, it's kind of funny, because you think of Exhorder vocals, you definitely think the American South. They're not quite as folksy, you know, not quite as twangy as the guy from Exhorder, but there's definitely that sort of an intonation on these. And it's good. It's a lot more mid-paced, you know, than what I was expecting. It's very heavy. Also, speaking of guitar tone, this is very thick and full. I don't know how many times they layered this on it, but it sounds fucking awesome. And especially for its time, you know, this is, I don't know, 92 or 93 that this came out. It's like a maxi EP. It's like 7 songs. Just like everything else that the Crypt does, there's a good, you know, group of liner notes here with the band talking about what they did and where they were at the time. Cool collage. And very enjoyable. The demo tacked on the end is more like straight up death metal of its era. Sounds like a demo. It's a little on the tinny side, but it's really good. It's called Lords of Torment. But yeah, much more brutal kind of death metal approach by the time you get to the demo. But awesome, brutal, heavy thrash with a little bit of a groove on it from Denmark. Next we go to Greece, still with the Crypt here. This is the Sarcastic Terror collection. The last act of subsidence. This was something that I think Eric Bauer talked about a while ago. Not sure if it was just in conversation or in one of his videos. I think he talked about it in one of his videos. Greek band, cool, interesting stuff, pretty unique approach. They're a death metal band, although this compiles 3 demos, if I'm not mistaken. The first demo on this, and a lot of the same songs are repeated, the first demo on this almost bleeds into like Greek black metal territory with like pretty simplistic but really hypnotizing and catchy kind of traditionally heavy metal inspired riffing with some spooky keys and stuff going on. And then their next demo after that, which is a little bit previous, is some of the same songs, different kind of approach just to recording and playing, where it sounds like a heavier kind of bolt thrower thing. And then by the time you get to the end of the CD, it's their first demo, which is mostly stuff that didn't make it onto the demos after, which is really fucking wacky, hard to listen to, but kind of awesome, amateurish, practice amp sounding guitars, and really fucking weird pitch shifted vocals. It sounds like something completely out of the bowels of hell. So you have a little bit of something for everybody here, or at least for 3 different people. But yeah, this came out great. I am very, very happy. I tracked that down finally because I'd heard people kind of sing the praises of Sarcastic Terror for a while. Next up, Anacrusis. Their first 2 albums, Suffering Hour and Reason. Just re-released by Metal Blade. Saw them on the rack at the store at Newberry. Decided I'd pull the trigger. I'm trying to remember. I remember their 90s records. Screams and Whispers, Manic Impressions. I think those are the 2. And liking them. I remember listening to them in high school and stuff. And remember them being like kind of weird, cold and proggy, kind of thrash metal, kind of mid-paced. And I feel like I was pretty much on the money. You could see where they were going with these kind of records then. You had this weird, you know, somewhat abstract kind of cover art there. Suffering Hour, super bleak church landscape. And even going to their first record, Suffering Hour, which is 89, I think, 88 or 89, they're doing some kind of all over the map stuff. Their vocalist has a really cool range where he can sing kind of traditional power metal style vocals, but he goes back and forth with like this kind of shrieking. There's a lot of like classic speed and thrash metal trappings thrown on this, but put in a blender. Kind of longer compositions, but very fun to listen to regardless. This is like a long record that I can listen to all the way through. Keeps me guessing. It's interesting. Same thing with this one. They mature a little bit on Reason here. Lots of like, the first song is a super like sad sounding, like kind of acoustic arpeggios and stuff like that, and very kind of prog leaning. And then just when they think they have you, they trick you, and they go into the song Terrified. It's a ball ripper. Yeah, fucking cool band. I've been wanting to check out this earlier stuff for quite a while. They certainly mix up the viciousness of it very well. You know, they definitely know how to play with your emotions, mess with your emotions. And they were great. They were from St. Louis, and I think they recently reformed, just like everybody and their mother. At War, Order to Kill. Always needed to check this out. I think I'm happy I did. We got kind of sloppy 3-piece power trio, kind of thrash, kind of speed metal, very based in kind of Venom, Motorhead kind of stuff, but a bit heavier. They were from, I think, Virginia or Maryland, somewhere down that way. Kind of tongue-in-cheek, hopefully, kind of jingoistic, you know, war-loving kind of lyrics. Very of its time. The last song's called Fuck Gaddafi. Some good songs on this. Some ass kickers, some ass beaters. I think most of the time, if I'm going to reach for jingoistic thrash, though, I'm probably going to grab my Carnivore record. Destruction. Live Without Sense. Needed to pick this up, especially after the discussion of live records. I think Marty talked about this. Yeah, it's just a great live record from early era Destruction. I'm trying to see when this came out. 89. So I think, you know, all their classic material was out at that point. Invincible Force is on here. They do Mad Butcher, of course. The Pink Panther jam. Bestial Invasion. Yeah, it's got most of the hits on it. The recording quality's good. It's a fun listen. That's upside down. Alright, and then I went on this kind of nosedive into like early brutal stuff, you know, something that I'm not super familiar with other than, if you want to count Cannibal Corpse, Suffocation. The first couple Internal Bleeding demos / CDs came out on Wild Rags back in the day. I was super into those. I loved early Skinless for a minute. You know, liked Dying Fetus Live, that kind of stuff. I've been just kind of curious about this shit, kind of the roots of the brutal and the slam stuff, and then picking up stuff that's more like the harbingers of that from the 90s before it kind of, you know, turned into this cartoonish sort of overly focused on weird aspects of it kind of genre. This I picked up. Ben just talked about this. This is the Embryonic Death Demos collection. Regurgitated Streams of Rot. I also picked this up because Radical Research, excellent podcast, talked about the third demo this band did, which is included on this. And it is it's a wild ride. If you want to hear somebody pontificate on it a little bit further, be sure to check out Brain Smasher's review of it. You know, I mean, weird technical stuff, of course, comes to mind, especially with very adept bass playing, early Cynic, Atheist, but also some of the kind of the wackiness of like Lethargy from Rochester, New York, Human Remains, but not really anything like those. I mean, talent-wise, some parts here and there, but very, very strange, very, very all over the place death metal. They did 3 demos in 3 years and broke up. The second demo, which is the first tracks on this, the arrangement's kind of weird, is great to me. I mean, it's straight up kind of brutal DM. The vocals are getting there as far as like ridiculously extreme. They're burpy, not chirpy, and I like it. There's a very strong kind of like sense of like, hey, we like Mental Funeral. Let's go into these like slower, dirgier parts with all the climbing, you know, that kind of shit. And it's really good. The first demo, you know, their first stab at things, it's pretty good. You know, they're probably, these guys were from New York and they were very young. They were probably like in their late teens or mid-teens even when they did their first demo, but it's also kind of autopsy worshipping, kind of typical of the era, you know, era and area, you know, that kind of NYDM sort of thing. But yeah, the stuff right smack dab in the middle on the CD is fucking weird and great. And I forgot the name of the demo off the top of my head, but I can always throw a caption in because I'm a cheater, and I'll do that right now. Next, we got Headrot. All these are on Pathos Productions, by the way. We got Headrot from Rhode Island, and this again is a bunch of collection of demos. I Gulp Your Guts demo, Agonizing Sufferance of Dismemberment, and the 7-inch. Another band, no idea they existed. They existed in my backyard many moons ago, before it was my backyard, you know. But I'm surprised with my obsession with like really old death metal stuff. This hasn't come across my lap, but just goes to show how much shit was out there. Very, very nicely done package, by the way, Mark Riddick. So yeah, this is also like really grimy American heavy bottom end death metal that would go on to be more and more kind of focusing on the brutal aspect of things. The first demo on here though is very like, yeah, it also is very kind of like Autopsy-ish. There's a good like dirgy sense to a lot of the riffs, and then they get a little bit, I'd say a little bit more, for lack of a better description, my imagination is failing me, probably more towards like a Suffocation, early Suffocation way about doing things, but very gory, you know, very fucking dark, very kind of almost sort of tongue-in-cheek horror influenced, and definitely worth a shot. Next up is a record that I've heard about for like 20 years and never listened to. It's Sermon of Mockery by Pyrexia. This didn't come out on Pathos. It's distributed by Pathos. Oh, Century Media. So, yeah, this band sounds like a lot like Suffocation, with a lot of the more nuanced aspects of it kind of stripped away. You know, there's a very loud bass sound, which was a nice change up from everything I've been listening to. Loud bass drums and vocals, and you can hear the guitars fine, but they almost take a back seat to like the interplay of all the aforementioned, especially the rhythm section of the bass and the drums. It's very like very precise, on point, almost bordering on like, I wouldn't say noodly, but very percussive and technical kind of bass work, you know, ironing out all these kind of very brutal, very climby kind of riffs. The guitars sound awesome too, you know, but they're, like I said, a little bit behind in the mix, which is interesting. And, you know, as far as the approach, it's a lot like Suffocation. Very, very similar to Suffocation in a lot of ways, but fucking great. You know, almost like no solos, which was an interesting thing that I noted. But yeah, just super in-your-face New York death metal style shit. Next up, Eternal Suffering from Massachusetts. Recollections of Tragedy and Misery. This is compiling a full length and an EP. This band was right around the turn of the century. Wayne, who was in this band, went on to be in Epitaph and Father Befouled, and I ended up with a bunch of his records, weirdly enough, via two different YouTubers who were just like, here's a bunch of stuff. Those people being Jason Hook and Ben Smasher. At any rate, none of that's really relevant here. This is great. Slamming, you know, I don't know, it's hard to exactly put it as a slamming kind of thing, because the context is totally different back then from how it is now. I feel like there's a good sense of like, you know, open E mosh going on with it, but it serves the purpose to like build up to faster, more brutal parts. It's definitely very heavy. I remember these guys, I must have seen them at least once or twice when I lived here 20 years ago. I know they probably played the Palladium numerous times at like the death fests and stuff that I went there, the hardcore and metal fests, but I remember hardcore kids loving this band and like wearing their hoodies and stuff. And there is a certain like kind of, as it happens, sort of like tough guy sort of moshy feel to it, but not intentional, I don't think. It's just, that's the way it kind of just ended up executing. But yeah, super heavy, stompy, and unique. Like their riff style doesn't sound like Pyrexia's or early Embryonic Death or Suffocation or Internal Bleeding. It's something, it's a little bit more drawn out. You could tell maybe they were listening to some Doom and kind of just incorporating it in their own way. Very cool. And finally, we got Pessimist, the last, you know, 90s death metal outside of like a Swedish thing, you know, American death metal, beginning of brutal death metal kind of band. They were from Maryland. Just super on point, you know, technically sound, right up in your grill, you know, abrasive heavy death metal with great bass playing on it. This is an odds and ends comp that came out on Pathos. It's got, you know, a bunch of covers on it. They do Pestilence, A Thousand Eyes by Death, Pestilence by Creator, Killing Is My Business, which actually turns out to be a really good cover, Phantasm by Possessed. Then there's a bunch of demo tracks. Some of the earliest tracks, they aren't quite growling yet. They almost sound like a brutal thrash kind of thing, like very Creator influenced. And then they go into sort of the same musical sphere again as Suffocation and Cannibal Corpse, but I feel like there's something a little bit more higher end and, dare I say, melodic? I'm not sure if I would say melodic. I know they sort of involved more of a black metal influence later on and were credited for that. So I feel like that's coming on, but it's not quite there yet. There's something that's just very, like, kind of focused about it, but I need to listen to it more. So, same disclaimer with all this stuff. Like, these are CDs that I've gotten the past couple of weeks, and I've listened to a lot, but they're brand new to me, so opinions vary and could change at any time. At any rate, we're done here. I'm done talking. I hope everyone has a good week. Bye.